Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.
Assalam wa rahmatullah.
Okay, sorry for my delay. My computer was just taking a long time to sync with WhatsApp on my laptop. Okay, so we are talking on the subject of Hinduism. And we had mentioned that there were 4 paths that people have to traverse. There were 4 things, right? The first one was pleasure. And Hinduism sees this as quite normal, natural. Connected with that is after you have exhausted pleasure, after having enjoyed pleasure, and you see that it's pointless. For example, it doesn't go anywhere. You know what I mean? Like, for example, in some of us in our party days, for example, you know, we saw partying as something pleasurable and something you want to do every weekend and stuff like that. You know, but this was an aspect of our adolescence, you know, of our youth. After a while, you see the party scene as something with people with, you know, very simple minds, and, you know, it was the same thing over and over again. You gave up that, you know, and the next stage that you go in terms of seeking some kind of meaning or pleasure in life is worldly success, again, for the individual, you know, the 3 prongs of wealth, fame, and power. And of course, this also has a limitation in its reality. You know, for example, you know, wealth, fame, and power are exclusive. Okay, you know, it's not something collective. It's one individual going after wealth, fame, and power, and it's therefore competitive, and therefore hence a dangerous thing. So, and also we realize that the drive for success is something insatiable. You know, you have, for example, you know, leaders of countries, political parties that are used to power, you know, and want to get more and more power. For example, they want to stay in power, you know, so you'd find that in like places like Azerbaijan, you find it in many countries in Africa and so on. So it's insatiable, and it's something that cannot be extinguished. By the way, I found a very beautiful quotation by Imam Ali alayhi salam, you know, where he says, wealth does not corrupt people. Wealth actually shows up people for who they are. Okay, the wealth shows you up for who you are. So this aspect about worldly success then is identical to hedonism. And again, it centers on the meaning of the self, you know, which is too small for you to be always seeking after these types of power and so on. And also that, you know, when you die, you leave this wealth and position and all of these things behind. So this also has a limitation, right? So this leads us to renunciation. Okay, renunciation, to renounce, is to forswear something, is to say, I'm not going to do this again. This thing is not good for me, or whatever, you know, decision that you might say about it. Because there's a path of renunciation. This path of renunciation is, you know, it is said it has 2 faces, really. You know, when you renounce something, there are 2 ways that you might renounce something. And they can be quite separate. For example, you could be disillusioned and despairing of the path you had taken to get to some particular goal, right? And then you reach a point where you find it is not worthwhile to extend yourself, to keep on going after that thing. So you say, well, look, you know what I mean? I don't really want this thing anymore. I used to want this particular thing, and now I don't, you know. So this type of a renunciation, for example, in medieval times, a man might love a woman, the love was not reciprocated, so he goes into a monastery. This is a kind of a renunciation. Um, that a person might be so wealthy, and in that wealth, they lost good friends. The people who made themselves their friends might have been people who wanted to parasite off of them and so on. And so they realize, well, look, with wealth, it's very difficult to have friends. So anyway, I wouldn't want more wealth anymore, right? Or I'm gonna give away my wealth or something like that. So this is one aspect, a renunciation that comes from disillusionment and despair. And the other one is renunciation because you want to get something that is greater. Okay. For example, an athlete who would resist indulgences, like partying the night before the games or the week before the games, foregoing a whole lot of stuff, a whole lot of pleasures in order to get the higher pleasure of success in a competition. And this is the type of renunciation that is applied in a religious context, that you renounce one's attachments, or you renounce one's evil deeds and so forth, in order to get a higher level of spirituality. And this is the type of renunciation that they talk about. Now, what are you renouncing? You're renouncing these pursuits to pleasure, whether that pleasure is a physical pleasure, like food, clothing, nice house, and things like that, or whether that pleasure is a psychological pleasure, right? So in this path of renunciation, this way towards renunciation is not really seen as a path per se. Okay, it's just a transition to something else. So in the first two cases of pleasure, in terms of physical pleasure, and also in terms of social or economic, personal wealth, power, and fame, and so on, the renunciation, like in the second case, is moving towards something greater. Okay, so these first two were things that really appeal to your ego, and that was about it. So you want to go to a greater pleasure, and that greater pleasure has two signposts, right? That rite of renunciation has two signposts, and the first one is the community, meaning that the person who has renounced personal gain in things, personal pleasure in these things. They want to attach themselves to something greater than the individual. And the first thing that comes to their mind, or the first thing that is apparent to them, is the community. And so at this moment, you find that what is produced is the religion of duty. Now, let's just sort of flip to Islam. Do we see any of these types of processes or practices in Islam? Well, yes. Islam's attitude towards pleasure is very much like the Hindu attitude towards pleasure. Islam is not against going towards pleasure, but Islam is for us to not be addicted to pleasure, okay, or any one particular pleasure, and also that this pleasure must be halal, it must not be forbidden, and you do whatever pleasure you indulge yourself in, you begin with the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. With respect to personal wealth and success and fame and so on, with fame, we are taught to counteract fame with humility. to spend of our wealth. And out of that, we have obligatory spending out of our wealth, and we have personal spending out of our wealth. For example, obligatory spending out of our wealth is spending on homes and zakah. Personal spending of wealth is what we call sadaqah. And so when we say zakah, for example, a very important meaning of zakah is comes from the word zakah itself, which means to purify, right? This is exactly what it does with respect to the relationship of the ego with the wealth. It purifies you from that wealth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, you have not given unless you give of that which you love. That love, it means being an attachment, an ego attachment to that wealth, which when you spend of it, it lessens or could even cut that ego attachment with that wealth. With respect to the religion of duty, addressing oneself to the community, we have hadith by the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that says the best of us are those who are beneficial for the community, and that community, meaning the individuals that you relate to in the community, is equivalent to your relationship with the individuals in the community is equivalent to our relationship with God. Like when Jesus Christ alayhi salam says in the New Testament that whatever you have done to any of these people, you have done to me. If you feed them, you feed me. If you clothe them, you clothe me, and so forth. We have the same thing in Islam, where the Prophet and the Imams have encouraged us, insisted that we thank each other. We thank each other. And it's very important because, people might think, if you thank God and not each other, then it's better. We should thank each other because thanking each other is also thanking God. We have to thank God too, of course, but thanking each other is also thanking God. So this religion of duty have transformed people, and you have whole religions, for example, that actually is based upon the religion of duty, like Confucianism, for example. This is a spiritual path that we call the path of service. The path of service, a very a very good example of that is Hazrat Abbas, the brother of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. But there's a criticism of it. It is also limited because duty too yields noble rewards. For example, it brings respect and gratitude from our peers. It gives us a self-respect that we find in ourselves when we have done our part. But in the end, these rewards are insufficient. Why? Because we die. We die. And where does all of that go then? So basically, we say that the full truth is that people would really like to have infinite being, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss. This is what people want. Infinite being. Being. What is being? Being is the self. That's all. And a being is the self. You're sitting there and I'm sitting here, right? What you there in your fullness, okay, and I here in my fullness is what we call being. And being has different levels. And many of these levels are levels that have been subjected to us, or has been how should I say, has emerged from us based upon our level of attachment to the world, basically. But we want to be infinite in our existence. We do not want to die, and the more we are attached to things in the world, the more we die because of the fact that these things that we attach to the world, we have to say goodbye to. And in saying goodbye to, because our egos were dependent upon them, it gained something from them, like self-respect, like the respect of other people and so forth. This reward also dies. So basically, we want to have an infinite being. In other words, to be around all the time. Not necessarily around in this world, but around all the time. And we want infinite knowledge. We want to gain knowledge. And when we say infinite, I would like to say that when we say infinite, we do not mean the infinite knowledge of God. Okay, we want an infinite knowledge on the level of us being humans as having infinite knowledge. And infinite knowledge meaning that knowledge that is relevant to us. The knowledge that is not relevant to us, we have no access to. An infinite bliss or infinite pleasure. And this is what people really want. In other words, they want to be liberated from limitation. And this liberation is what we call in Hinduism moksha. Moksha. So moksha is that level of existence where we have infinite being, and we have extensive knowledge, and we also are experiencing extensive bliss. Now, with respect to the fact that we might be dying and we might die and leave these things, Hinduism makes a very interesting statement in that it says we already possess this. We already possess these things. Now, but how? Okay. Well, what Hinduism posits is that in the very core of our being, the very core of our being is a divine spark, which is called Atman. A divine spark, which is called Atman. And higher than Atman is Brahman. Brahman is their version of the one God, okay? And there's a relationship between Atman and Brahman that what you really want to do is unite Atman, or unite your central spiritual self with the higher reality of God. And the human being cannot be completely accounted for. You cannot talk about a total human being unless you talk about these three aspects. All right, first the body of the human being, then the personality of the human being, these two things being quite related in terms of our pleasures, and our attachments and so on. And then we have the Atman Brahman reality, which is what is the goal of reality. Here again, we find a parallel in Islam, where Imam Ali alayhi salam says to us, don't look at ourselves as a small infinite being. Indeed, in us are all the worlds, all of the worlds. And we say the worlds, you mean the heavenly worlds as well. You mean the worlds of the angels. All of the worlds are in us. Now, what does it mean by this all of the world, all of creation, is in us? I want you to visualize the number line, okay? The X and Y axis and where they cross. And if one asks the question then, what is zero? What is zero? And some people will say zero is nothing, but that's not the truth at all. Because if zero was nothing, it would not be able to be represented. Nothing cannot be represented by anything, okay? And also the zero in has relationships with the other numbers. So when you look on the number line, the X and Y axis, where they intersect, what do you find? You find zero. Okay, now zero zero in this example is positioned somewhere. You know, you ask somebody, where is the zero? They will point where the x and y axis intersect. You'd ask, so what if you separate the x-axis from the y-axis? Do you still have zero? Well, of course you do, because zero is in the exact middle where the two powers, the positive, which is on the right, and the negative, which is on the left, with respect to the x-axis, or the positive, which is above, and the negative, which is below, which is the y-axis, where they balance each other out. So these powers neutralize each other, and this is where zero appears, I say. Because if you move one level right on the x-axis, let's say you get to the number +1, you know, when you ask what is there, you see that's a +1. That's one is there, you know. But if you, again, neutralize +1 by adding a -1, what do you get? Lo and behold, you get zero. So zero is all through the x and the y axes, but it is masked or superimposed by value. When you take away that value, when you neutralize that value, what you find is zero. Now remember, the statement in the Holy Quran, everything is fading away except the face of Allah. And when we are talking about the Atman as the spirit, so I'm interpreting it as a spirit, you see. How do you find resonance with this in Islam? Well, we find that God breathes into human being, okay, from himself, the life of a human being, the intellect also of a human being. God breathes from himself into that human being. So that human being has in their center of centers the breath of God, or the spirit, okay, that defines them. Then you have the statement by Imam Ali alayhi salam, where he says, "Man arafa nafsahu arafa rabbahu." He who knows himself knows his Lord. Okay, does it mean that you are God? Some people interpret or claim to say these types of things. You are God. You know, the Nation of Islam, we used to say that. You know, you have a whole lot of New Agers saying that you are God, or God is in you, and all that type of thing, but they don't know what they are talking about. When he says, if you know yourself, you know your Lord, you have to peel away the ones and the twos and the -1s and the -2s and contact your zero. And it's very interesting, the symbol of zero itself. You know, in Arabic, the zero is a point. Okay, the zero is a point. And in geometry, a point is described or defined as something that has neither length, width, nor breadth. In other words, a point defies physical definition. That's what a point is. A point has no dimension whatsoever. Okay, a point, in a sense, is the first appearance of creation in the face of non-existence. That's what a point is. A point is characterized, like, for example, when you're about to write something on a piece of paper or draw something on a piece of paper, the first thing you do is place your pencil or the pen or the brush or whatever on the paper, which is what? A point. And from that point, you start to write. So the writing is, everything is proceeding from that point. You know, in other words, that point has all of the thoughts, outcome of that, whatever you're writing, the words, everything goes back to that point. Okay, and so you could meditate on the idea of the Big Bang, where we talk about the expansion of the universe from a singularity. You know, that singularity could be like, for example, the point. And in fact, a singularity, when they talk about that singularity in which the entire universe, exploded from, that singularity was something that could not be seen. It was so small. could not be seen. All time, matter, all the matter in space, everything, light, heat, everything was wrapped up in that one singularity, which exploded outward in terms of the Big Bang. You find that in the Latin languages or the Latin culture, like English, French, Spanish, and so forth, the culture of Europe, the zero is a circle. The circle is like the point expanded. Yeah, and the circle also is classified in geometry as the perfect shape. The most perfect shape is the circle, you know, or the most perfect being is the sphere, or the most perfect thing that exists is the sphere. And you have people like Ibn Arabi, the great Sufi Shaykh, that said of the existence of Adam, you know, before the creation of Eve, that being was a perfect sphere. Okay, that nafs, that original nafs on which human beings were created was a perfect sphere. You know, Allah says, for example, He created you from one nafs, and from it He made its mate. That perfect square was what that nafs was. And the separation from that nafs of its feminine principle. And that perfect nafs had in itself both the masculine and feminine principles. And then it separated into a separate feminine principle and a separate masculine principle, which is what we know of Adam and Eve as the two first humans. What we are here to do from the Hindu point of view is to unify our spirits with that of God, you know, to be one with God in this sense. Of course, you know, even in paradise, we are separate, you know, and this is to maintain our identities and for us to experience the pleasures as a creature of God. But basically, we have to be one with God. And the ideal type for being one with God are the great prophets. And among the great prophets, our Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi. You know, there's a very interesting hadith I discovered some years ago, where the Holy Prophet, I don't know if it's a Shia hadith or a Sunni hadith, but it was very, very instructional, where the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi said, I am an Arab without the Ain, meaning if you take the A out of Arab, you get Rab, meaning Lord. Okay. What else did he say? I am Ahmed without the meme. It means Ahad. Take the M out of Ahmad, you get A-H-A-D, Ahad. He who has seen me has seen God. Okay, not that he is God, right? But he is sort of a manifestation of God, you know, and this is not something alien in Islam. You know, we make a quick distinction between in what we're saying to avoid shirk, right? But it is also said in Islam. You know, it talks in Islam, it talks about people who remind you of God, you know, like ulama, not people like me. I'm not a really good alim. But like, you know, great ulama like Imam Khomeini, Rahmatullah, Behjat, and so on. When you look upon these people, they remind you of God, you see, and not just in terms of, well, you know, this person kind of reminds me of what I should do in Islam and stuff like that. No, a real true alim or a real true spiritual person will remind you of God. You know, when I remember, you know, a story about Imam Khomeini, Rahmatullah, he was arrested. He was taken to prison, you know, and usually when people who were, you know, fighting for the revolution in Iran, when they were captured by Savak, the very vicious secret police, usually they'll disappear. They will be killed and thrown in some salt lake near Qom or something like that. They'll disappear. And so Imam Khomeini goes into this car, and he's calm, seriously calm. And the police man next to him, guarding him, he started to shiver like a leaf. You know, Imam Khomeini, rahmatullahi, had to calm him down. This is it being in the presence of somebody that reminds you of God. You know, you have a lot of cases like this, you know, in terms of the Imam Khomeini, rahmatullah himself. You know, when Shevardnadze, the foreign minister for the Soviet Union, came to visit Imam Khomeini, rahmatullah. And he said that Shevardnadze was sitting on one of those, you know, regular four-legged chairs. You know, he didn't get any big treatment, you know, a VIP treatment or anything like that. And Imam Khomeini rahmatullah came into the room. He wasn't even wearing his turban. He came in with his kufi, you know, just to show you know, the Russians, or sorry, the Soviet Union, that we do not see you as anything big. And it said that Shevardnadze was, again, trembling and sweating like a leaf. Okay, this is what we're talking about, because, you know, people like that, there are two kinds of people who see their light: people who have a light themselves, you know, or people who have darkness. You know, when they come into contact with people like that, you know, they become extremely agitated and afraid. So, you know, the question is, how do we get to this zero? How do we get to this zero? How do we get to this Atman? Well, you know, this eternal light, it is buried under the most impenetrable mass of distractions, false assumptions, you know, instincts, you know, things that when we compare ourselves to others, you know, we see ourselves as ones and twos and so forth, and we cannot get into touch with the center of our being, which is our zero, which is the Atman. And so the life poses a problem to us. You know, life is something where you have to clean off the soul, clean off from our being, where a point is reached where that infinite center, you know, that breath of God, that, you know, ultimate reality of ourselves, you know, that combination of the special names of God that give us our own personality and our own character, when that starts to shine out in ourselves, then we get it in full display. And at that point, yes, then we have arrived in a certain sense. Then we have arrived. You know, so, you know, when you see pictures, for example, you know, with saints having halos and so on, tend to be pretty much universal in religion. In the Arabic and Persian tradition, for example, they put flame around the head of a spiritual person. This is what exactly those people have seen. Okay, not the artist. You know, it might have been reported to him, but this is exactly what people see. You know, there's a hadith by Hazrat Aisha about the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that said his light, his personal light, was so strong that if you dropped a needle in the room at night, you can find it. Okay, but again, this light is not something that everybody can see. It's only the striving believer, or the implacable enemy of truth. They can see these lights. So one of the other things that we're talking about is eternal bliss, right? Eternal bliss, eternal joy, eternal pleasure. And also, again, we are confronted with the aspect of death. Now, where does joy reside? Okay, where does joy reside? Joy resides in the self, but the self as a body, for example, is limited and it will die. So this joy is something that seems to be fleeting. But if we expand the self to go beyond the body, because you know the body is just the body, right? The self is something greater than the body. Okay. Um, you have so many cases of great saints um, avoiding pain by just their will. You know, you have a story of Alametabatai when he went to England for an operation on his eye. They wanted to put him under anesthesia. He said that he did not want to come under anesthesia. You know, the surgeons asked him, well, what can we do? Because if we do not put you under anesthesia and we start to operate on your eye, you will move your eye and it will make things bad. You know, we need the eye immobile. He said, I will command my eye not to move. And he did. You know, they had the operation. He didn't take any anesthesia. It was quite calm. And the operation proceeded, you know, well. There's another story of Swami Vivekananda, you know, a great sage in Hinduism. He died of throat cancer. And, you know, he was being tested in the hospital and they put the probe and touched where the cancer was, you know, and he winced in pain. And the person pulled back and the man, he said, hold on, hold on, hold on. And concentrated for a while and says, okay, now you can do what you're doing. What he did was, again, shut down the nervous impulses that were around his throat. So he could, you know, not feel it and this examination could go on. So if you expand the self, if the self is expanded to, let's say, reach a point where it has a God's eye view of humanity, a God's eye view of humanity. You're looking at humanity from above now, looking at yourself from above. When you see everything under that aspect of eternity, it would make one objective to oneself. For example, one would see exactly what wisdom failure had, you know, that one might have suffered. Huh? Whereas, for example, when we are on the earth, when we get failure, you know, we take it personally and so on. But you can see, let's say, for example, failure, you know, it is on the same level as success. You would find that, for example, let's say you might have been in a competition and you lost and you felt really bad. When you look from above, you would see the victory of the successful competitor, and your failure would be the same. And so you go beyond your own subjective attitudes towards pleasure and pain. And so this is the way to overcome or to get a greater understanding of the reality of life. Later on, when we look in Buddhism, we will see that Buddhism also has something quite similar. Now the other great limitation of human life is ignorance. Okay, that we don't have infinite knowledge. And the Hindus also claim that this is removable as well. The Hindu book, the Upanishads, speak of, quote unquote, knowing of that, meaning knowing of that thing. All right. Why would they use the word that? Because that is too expansive to call it by a particular name. Okay. We have a similar thing in Islam in terms of doing dhikr and calling upon Allah. One very powerful dhikr is Yahoo. And Yahoo is like that, oh him, oh he. All right. Why do you refer to God as he? Because that he points to the essence of God. Right. So it says in the Upanishads, it talks about knowing of that, the knowledge of which, going back to that, the knowledge of which that brings knowledge of everything. Meaning, you know God. If you know God, you know everything. If you know God, you know everything. And then of course now, again, when you're talking about knowing God, we're talking about knowing God within the capacity of the knower. Okay. When we talk about everything, we do not mean literally everything, but everything that one is confronted with, one is experiencing. Didn't Adam, for example, know everything when Allah taught him all the names? Did he know everything? Taught him all the names. And there's no indication that God just taught him all the names of things on earth. Okay, it can mean the names of all things are beyond earth. And why not? You, me, we are in ourselves, the entire cosmos, all of the worlds, not just this physical world. All right, this physical world has infinite space and infinite time within a physical context, but you have worlds above the physical world that don't have time, or their time is the eternal moment. Then that too we can know. So as for life's third limitation, which is restricted being, okay, we have to ask ourselves first, how is the boundary of the self to be defined? How do we define the self? Do we define ourselves by our bodies? Do we define ourselves by our psychological states? Well, it makes more sense to define ourselves or see the boundary of ourselves by our spirits, the range of the reality which they identify. Okay, so when our spirits identify with reality, the higher the reality, the wider the reality, the greater the self, the greater the spirit. And so you'd find people, for example, whose reality is much smaller than other people's. And people like, for example, the prophets and the great saints, their reality is much, much wider, much greater. The Hindus also approach the question of death by looking at this question both in a spatial sense and also in terms of time. Strictly speaking, when we look at ourselves living in this world, every moment of our lives is a dying. We go one step closer towards death. A certain aspect of our egos move away, die away. You know what I mean? Like, for example, I don't know, the fame that you had with people and that type of thing. And these things are never to be reborn. But when we look at ourselves, even though we might be dying at every moment, even though every breath that we take is one less breath we'll be taking in the future, we don't equate ourselves with our individual moments. And so we experience them without, focusing on their singularity. They are just part of the life that we move along with. And what Hinduism takes this notion and does, it posits an extensive self that lives successive lives in the way a single life lives successive moments. So your being is expanded, but it's expanded in space and time. What Islam would say is our being goes beyond space and time, and that in death, we are liberated from our physical beings, good and bad. Where we go is a world higher than this one, where we exist in a purer form, before we come back here on the Day of Judgment. Okay, so I can stop here because we only have about 6 more minutes. And let's take some questions. If anybody would like to ask questions, here we are ready for them. Okay, I guess silence means everybody understands what's going on. Inshallah, I want to thank you for coming, and I will see you again with this topic next Friday, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.